The click of the heavy oak door's brass deadbolt sounded like a dry bone snapping in the quiet of the cabin. It was exactly 3:14 p.m. on a Tuesday. Outside, the Blue Ridge Mountains were painted in the brilliant burning golds of late October, but inside cabin number 4 at the Blackwood Cabins, the air felt like a tomb. The man who had just locked the door slipped the brass key into the pocket of his trousers. His name was Marcus. He was easily 250 pounds, built like a cinder block, and wearing a suit that was aggressively tailored but made of cheap, shiny polyester. He smelled of stale cigarettes, old leather, and a suffocating over-application of Drakkar Noir cologne. He didn't say a single word. He just stood there, crossing his massive arms, effectively blocking the only exit out of the rustic, wood-paneled room. The funny thing about absolute terror is how quiet it is. When the bottom finally drops out of your life, there are no sirens or flashing lights. You just stop keeping score, and the world shrinks down to the sound of your own measured breathing. I pulled my gaze away from the human barricade at the door and looked down at the rough-hewn pine dining table. Sitting dead center was a pristine stack of legal documents. I could read the bold, black, laser-printed heading on the top page even from a foot away. Irrevocable transfer of assets and release of claim. Resting neatly on top of the signature line was a cheap, transparent blue Bic ballpoint pen. The plastic cap was slightly chewed. Across the table stood Richard, my husband, the man I had shared a bed with for 30 years, the man whose laundry I had folded, whose children I had birthed, and whose mild-mannered insurance adjuster persona was currently unraveling before my very eyes. A bead of sweat traced a slow, jagged path down the side of his pale face, disappearing into the collar of his expensive new flannel shirt. He wouldn't look me in the eye. He just kept staring nervously at the blue pen. I looked at the heavy-set man standing between me and the cabin door, then down at the inheritance transfer papers my husband of 30 years had just shoved across the pine table. A betrayal isn't a sudden explosion. It's a slow leak in a dark room, silent and toxic, until one day someone strikes a match. Richard was standing there holding the match, waiting for me to be the one to burst into flames. He expected tears. He expected the hysterical, panicked begging of a 58-year-old woman who suddenly realized her entire life's savings, the $350,000 inheritance from her late parents, was being forcefully extorted in the middle of nowhere. "It's just a formality, Sarah," Richard finally mumbled, his voice carrying the sickening, hollow cadence of a cornered animal trying to sound authoritative. "Marcus is a business partner. We just need to finalize this capital transfer to secure our portfolio. Just sign the bottom, and we can get back to our vacation." Some women fall apart when they find out the truth. They let the shock of the betrayal shatter their spine. I am not that woman. Panic is a luxury reserved for those who do not have a plan. I looked at the cheap blue pen. I thought about my mother standing on her feet for 12 hours a day behind the counter of a dusty Ohio hardware store, her hands calloused and stained with grease, saving every dime she could. I thought about my father, organizing rusted bolts into glass jars, skipping vacations so he could leave something behind for his family. That $350,000 wasn't just money. It was 40 years of their blood, sweat, and quiet dignity. And here was the man I married, trying to use a loan shark to strip it away from me. Marcus cleared his throat, a thick, guttural sound, and cracked his scarred knuckles. It was a practiced, theatrical move designed to make the air in the room feel physically heavy. He took half a step forward. The floorboards groaned in protest under his weight. Men who rely on intimidation always make the same fundamental miscalculation. They assume women are afraid of the dark, simply because we prefer to leave the lights on. I didn't reach for the pen. I didn't flinch. I sat perfectly still in the high-backed wooden dining chair, folding my hands neatly in my lap. I let the silence stretch out, let the tension pull so taut it felt like the walls of the cabin might cave in on us. Richard's breathing grew shallower. He was waiting for me to break. He thought I was trapped in the woods with a predator, but he was about to learn I had locked the door to trap him. To understand how I arrived at this table, with a thug named Marcus breathing down my neck and a blue ballpoint pen demanding my parents' legacy, you have to understand who I was. I wasn't born into country clubs or trust funds. For 30 years, I defined myself by 3 simple, sturdy titles: mother, wife, and steward of our family's modest, hard-won peace. I met Richard in the spring of 1994. He was an insurance adjuster for State Farm, a man who spent his days calculating risk, evaluating damage, and determining what broken things were worth. He wore sensible tan Dockers, drove exactly at the speed limit in the right-hand lane, and possessed a mild, unremarkable demeanor that I mistook for stability. When you grow up working class, stability is the ultimate romance. You don't look for fireworks, you look for a solid foundation. And a foundation is exactly what I poured every ounce of my energy into building. We raised two beautiful children, Mark and Sarah. I stayed home during their early years, stretching a single middle-class salary until it screamed for mercy. When Mark needed braces, I took a remote data entry job, typing from 9 p.m. to 1 a.m. just to cover the $150 monthly installments. I spent my Sunday mornings obsessively clipping Red Plum and SmartSource coupons to keep our grocery bill under $70 a week. I knew the exact layout of the Kroger on Elm Street, hunting for yellow clearance tags at 8 a.m. sharp. I drove a 10-year-old Honda Accord with a sticky radio dial and a faint smell of spilled juice boxes, refusing to upgrade because a new car loan felt like a chain around my neck. The thing about raising a family on a tight budget is that you stop keeping score. You just give. You give until giving feels like breathing. And then one day, someone you gave everything to looks you in the eye and asks what exactly you've contributed. I was the kind of woman who mended socks rather than buying new ones, because I believed every dollar saved was a brick in the fortress of our family's future. I learned that quiet frugality from my parents, Thomas and Martha. For 4 decades, they ran a small, independent hardware store in Canton, Ohio. 6 days a week, my father swept the concrete floors and organized brass fittings into little glass jars. 6 days a week, my mother stood behind the heavy oak counter, balancing the ledger with a sharp pencil and a sharper mind. They didn't take vacations to Europe. They didn't buy luxury cars. Their greatest indulgence was a Sunday pot roast and the quiet pride of knowing they owed nothing to anyone. When they passed away within 8 months of each other, my father from a sudden heart attack, my mother from what I am certain was a broken heart, they left behind their life's work. A cashier's check for exactly $350,000. It wasn't lottery money. It was the physical manifestation of their aching joints, their skipped holidays, and their unwavering love. It was meant to be the ultimate safety net for their grandchildren, a shield against the harsh unpredictability of the world. A mother's love is often measured in the things she refuses to spend on herself. I deposited that check into a high-yield savings account at Chase Bank and didn't touch a single penny. It was sacred ground. For 30 years, I thought Richard understood this. I thought he respected the quiet dignity of a life lived within our means. He packed his lunch in a brown paper bag, wore his Timex watch until the leather strap frayed, and complained about the rising cost of electricity whenever I bumped the thermostat past 68 degrees in the dead of winter. He loved to give me lectures on fiscal responsibility. We were partners in the business of survival, or so I thought. But a marriage is a funny thing. You can share a bed with a man for 10,000 nights and never truly know the landscape of his mind. You can memorize the way he clears his throat before he speaks, or the way he folds the Sunday newspaper, but remain completely blind to the rot festering behind his eyes. I had spent my entire adult life meticulously laying bricks to protect my family. I had weathered the storms of childhood illnesses, late-night fevers, and the agonizing arithmetic of paying for tuition. I thought I was standing on solid ground. I thought the man beside me was my greatest ally. For 3 decades, I believed I was married to a man who helped build that fortress, until a careless mistake in the garage showed me he was actively trying to burn it down. I came home early that Tuesday. I wish I hadn't. But I also know that if I hadn't, I would have spent the rest of my life not knowing why everything felt wrong. It was October 3rd, exactly 2:15 p.m. The weather had just started to turn crisp, and I had decided to spend the afternoon sweeping out the detached garage. Tucked in the far corner, hidden behind a stack of broken lawnmower parts, sat a pristine, heavy navy blue Callaway golf bag. Richard didn't golf. When I had asked him about it a month prior, he smoothly lied, claiming he had won it at a State Farm regional conference raffle. I grabbed the nylon handle to move it out of the way, but it was unusually heavy, causing it to tip over on the concrete. A zipper on the side pocket slid open. I knelt in the dust to zip it back, but my fingers brushed against crumpled paper. I pulled it out. It was a formal letter, stamped repeatedly in aggressive red ink. The header read, Apex Asset Recovery. The bold text below demanded immediate payment of a severely delinquent balance. The number printed at the bottom was exactly $45,000. The truth doesn't announce itself with trumpets. It waits quietly in the dark corners you rarely clean. I didn't confront him when he came home at 5:30 p.m. I served him a plate of chicken piccata, asked him about his day, and watched him eat. The next morning, Wednesday at 9 a.m. sharp, I drove my Honda to the Chase Bank branch on Main Street. I sat in a glass office with a young branch manager named Brittany, who had a picture of a golden retriever on her desk. I asked her to pull a full credit report and a statement on our joint accounts. Brittany looked at her screen, her professional smile faltering. She gently informed me that the second mortgage on our house, the home we had supposedly paid off 5 years ago, was entirely maxed out. $80,000 in equity vanished. I drove home in silence. I walked straight into our bedroom, opened Richard's sock drawer, and bypassed the neatly folded argyle pears. I ran my hand along the back wooden panel until I felt cold metal, a small brass key. Some women fall apart when they find out the truth. I am not that woman. I made coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and started making a list. At 11:45 a.m., I stood inside the USPS building on 4th Avenue. The brass key slid perfectly into P-Box 412. I pulled out a thick stack of mail. It wasn't just Apex Asset Recovery. There were statements from offshore sports betting sites like Bovada. There were aggressive collection notices for high-interest private loans. I sat in my car in the post office parking lot with a calculator app open on my phone. The total debt wasn't $45,000. It was a staggering $250,000. My husband, the frugal insurance adjuster who lectured me about leaving the porch light on, was a degenerate gambler. He had gambled away our equity, his secret loans, and our future on college football spreads and international basketball games. He was entirely underwater, drowning in a black sea of his own making, and the sharks were finally circling. And then, I realized the timing. My parents' estate had finally cleared probate. The $350,000 cashier's check was scheduled to be mailed to our home the very next week. A man drowning will pull down anyone to save himself, especially the woman who has spent 30 years keeping him afloat. Friday evening arrived. Richard walked through the front door at 6 p.m., whistling a cheerful tune. He was carrying a dozen red roses wrapped in plastic from the grocery store. He kissed my cheek, his breath smelling faintly of peppermint. He proudly announced that he had booked a surprise second honeymoon for us, a secluded rental at Blackwood Cabins in the Blue Ridge Mountains, a place with no cell service, no internet, and no distractions. We were leaving Tuesday, the exact day my parents' inheritance was set to hit my account. He poured me a glass of Merlot and smiled, talking about rekindling our romance in the mountains. Unaware, I was looking at a man calculating the exact price of my parents' blood, sweat, and tears. He thought I was packing lingerie for a romantic getaway, but he had no idea what I had actually placed at the bottom of my suitcase. If you've ever had to quietly protect yourself from someone you thought you could trust, you know the strength it takes to stay silent. Leave a like on this video to support the women who fight their battles in the quiet, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story of quiet justice. I took the cheap cellophane-wrapped roses from Richard, smiled, and put them in a glass vase on the kitchen island. I didn't throw them in his face. I didn't pack a bag and storm out into the night. I made him dinner, asked him about his afternoon, and listened to him meticulously describe a fictional meeting he had attended. A younger version of myself would have screamed, cried, and demanded answers. But at 58, you learn that tears are a waste of perfectly good hydration. When Monday morning rolled around, I made Richard his usual scrambled eggs, kissed his cheek, and watched his Honda back out of the driveway at exactly 7:45 a.m. The moment his taillights vanished around the corner of Elm Street, my mourning period ended, and my work began. At 9:30 a.m., I was sitting in a high-backed leather chair in downtown Columbus, Ohio. Across from me sat Arthur Pendleton, my parents' fiercely protective estate attorney. Arthur was 72 years old, wore a three-piece tweed suit, and possessed a legal mind as sharp as a scalpel. He had drawn up the original paperwork for my father's hardware store 30 years ago, and he smelled faintly of lemon polish and old, important paper. You cannot negotiate with a parasite. You can only starve it of its food source. I slid the $350,000 cashier's check across Arthur's mahogany desk, followed closely by the printouts of Richard's offshore gambling debts and the aggressive Apex recovery notices I had found in the P.O. box. Arthur looked at the papers in absolute silence. He didn't offer pity, which I deeply appreciated. He simply adjusted his reading glasses, looked me in the eye, and asked exactly how airtight I wanted the vault to be. By 11:45 a.m., the cashier's check was endorsed and legally rerouted. We established an ironclad, irrevocable generation-skipping trust. The sole beneficiaries were my grandchildren, 4-year-old Leo and 2-year-old Maya. The parameters were flawless. The funds were instantly locked behind a fortress of legal clauses. It could not be touched by Richard, it could not be seized by his creditors, and to ensure complete and absolute protection, it could not even be dissolved by me. True power isn't about being the loudest person in the room. It's about holding the only key to the only lock that matters. Arthur handed me the finalized documents, thick, heavy parchment bound with a navy blue ribbon and stamped with his firm's golden embossed seal. Leaving the law office, I drove to a luggage shop at the Easton Town Center. At 1:15 p.m., I spent $45 on a sleek, black leather locking portfolio. I placed the trust documents inside, set the 3-digit combination lock to my parents' anniversary, and slid it into my overnight bag, burying it safely beneath a stack of sensible wool sweaters. My final task required cash. I withdrew $200 from an ATM, a small enough amount to evade Richard's daily, anxious monitoring of our dwindling joint accounts. Sitting in my car, I called a local company called Appalachian Transit, operating out of the Blue Ridge Mountains. I spoke to a dispatcher named Earl. I gave him a very specific set of instructions and overnighted the $200 cash via FedEx to their depot. A black Lincoln Town car was to idle at the dirt road edge of the Blackwood Cabins property line. It was to arrive at exactly 4 p.m. on Tuesday. It was to wait for a woman named Sarah. When you are planning an exit, leave no digital footprint for a desperate man to follow. Tuesday morning arrived crisp and bright. I watched Richard load our bags into the trunk of the car with a sickening kind of enthusiastic energy. He was practically vibrating with anticipation, whistling as he checked the tire pressure. He thought he was brilliant. He thought 30 years of my quiet domesticity equated to a profound lack of intelligence. We took Route 221 up into the mountains. The cell service bars on my iPhone slowly dropped from 3 to 2 to 1 and finally to no service. Richard turned up the volume on a classic rock station, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel, completely immersed in his own arrogant delusion. He smiled at me, a wide, predatory grin masked as marital affection. As we drove up the winding, isolated mountain roads, Richard patted my knee, thinking he was leading a lamb to the slaughter, but he didn't know the butcher was already out of business. The hardest part of any plan is smiling at the person who is trying to destroy you. Have you ever had to play the long game against a narcissist? Tell me your story in the comments below, and make sure you're subscribed for the final reveal. Tuesday afternoon at precisely 3:10 p.m., a heavy, rhythmic knock echoed through the quiet of cabin number 4. Richard practically leapt from the faded floral sofa, feigning a look of complete bewilderment that would have gotten him laughed off a community theater stage. He opened the door, and in stepped Marcus. As the heavy oak door was locked behind him, the trap was officially sprung. Richard rushed over to his canvas duffel bag, pulling out a thick manila folder. His hands were shaking, though I suspected that was the only genuine part of his performance. He slapped the folder down onto the rustic pine table right in front of me, placing the cheap blue ballpoint pen on top. "Sarah, honey, you have to listen to me," Richard began, his voice dropping into an octave of manufactured panic. "I made a bad investment, a terrible mistake. And Marcus here? His employers, they need their capital returned today. If we don't pay them, I don't know what they're going to do to us." He paused, waiting for my gasp of horror. When none came, he pushed the papers an inch closer. "It's just the inheritance from your parents. If you just sign this transfer, we can clear the debt. We can go back to normal. You have to save us, Sarah." A liar's greatest weakness is his absolute certainty that everyone else in the room is as gullible as he is. I sat there looking at the man I had married, realizing that he wasn't just a degenerate gambler, he was a coward. He had brought a 250-pound enforcer to a remote cabin in the woods because he was too afraid to simply ask his wife for her money. He needed me terrified, he needed me compliant. Marcus took his cue, stepping away from the door and towering over the table. He cracked his scarred knuckles, a loud snapping sound in the silent cabin. He crossed his massive arms, glaring down at me with cold, dead eyes. I didn't speak. I didn't beg. I simply placed my index finger on the edge of Richard's transfer papers and calmly slid them back across the rough wood table. There is a unique kind of peace that washes over you when you finally stop trying to save a man who is determined to drown. Without breaking eye contact with my husband, I reached down to the floors beside my chair and unzipped my overnight bag. I pulled out the sleek black leather portfolio. I spun the 3-digit brass dial to 061, my parents' wedding anniversary, and the lock clicked open with a sharp, satisfying snap. I extracted the heavy, premium parchment, the crisp blue ribbon, Arthur Pendleton's golden embossed legal seal gleaming in the cabin's muted afternoon light. I placed the finalized trust documents gently on top of Richard's worthless transfer forms. Then I spoke precisely 3 sentences. "The $350,000 you are attempting to extort no longer exists in any liquid form," I said, my voice steady, measured, and entirely devoid of warmth. As of yesterday morning, every single penny was moved into an irrevocable generation-skipping trust for our grandchildren, Leo and Maya. It cannot be touched by me, it cannot be seized by any of your creditors, and it most certainly cannot be spent by you. I watched the words hit the table. It took exactly 3 seconds for the reality of the situation to settle over the room. You can hire a wolf to scare the sheep, but it's a dangerous game when the pasture turns out to be entirely empty. Marcus was a brute, but he was not an idiot. He was a businessman who dealt in the currency of leverage, and he realized instantly that the leverage was gone. He stopped glaring at me. The aggressive, physical intimidation immediately dropped from his broad shoulders. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his heavy head and locked his terrifying, dead-eyed gaze entirely onto Richard. Richard's face drained of all blood. His jaw went slack. The manufactured panic he had been acting out just moments ago was instantly replaced by genuine, suffocating terror. He looked at the trust documents, then at Marcus, and finally, desperately at me. I stood up from the wooden chair. I reached into my cardigan pocket, pulled out the printed business card for Appalachian Transit, and placed it neatly on top of the pile. I watched my husband look at the man he had brought to intimidate me, suddenly realizing that without my money, he was the only prey left in the room. I picked up my bag and walked toward the exit. Marcus didn't try to block my path. He simply took a half step back, granting me the space to open the heavy oak door. The crisp, clean mountain air hit my face, smelling of pine needles and absolute freedom. I pulled my suitcase over the gravel driveway toward my waiting town car, leaving Richard to explain to a very impatient loan shark why the bank was officially closed. The ride down Route 221 in the back of the black Lincoln Town car was the most profound silence I have ever experienced. I didn't turn around to look back at cabin number 4. I didn't check my phone to see if Richard had miraculously found a signal. I simply watched the brilliant burning golds and reds of the autumn leaves blur past the tinted window, feeling the immense crushing weight of a 30-year mistake finally lift from my shoulders. When a woman decides she is truly done, there is no grand explosion. There is only the quiet, irreversible closing of a door. By the time I reached my home in Ohio, the sun had fully set. The house was empty, and for the first time in 3 decades, it actually felt like mine. I changed into a pair of soft cotton pajamas, brewed a cup of chamomile tea, and sat in my favorite floral armchair. The only sound in the house was the steady, rhythmic ticking of the Howard Miller grandfather clock in the hallway, counting down the seconds of my new, unburdened life. The aftermath of Richard's fatal miscalculation was swift, brutal, and entirely of his own making. I filed for divorce the very next morning, armed with Arthur Pendleton's legal expertise and a mountain of financial evidence that left Richard completely defenseless in court. He didn't even attempt to fight it. He couldn't afford a lawyer, let alone a legal battle against a woman who had meticulously documented every single one of his betrayals. You cannot rebuild a home on a foundation of lies. You simply have to pack up your tools and find a new plot of land. 2 weeks after the incident at the cabin, his beloved 10-year-old Honda Accord was aggressively repossessed from the parking lot of his office at State Farm. They fired him shortly after, citing a violation of the company's moral turpitude clause when the extent of his illegal offshore gambling became public knowledge. He filed for personal bankruptcy within the month, a desperate, pathetic attempt to shield himself from the ruin he had brought upon his own head. But a court-ordered bankruptcy doesn't protect you from men like Marcus. Today, my former husband lives in a $40 a night Nights Inn off Interstate 71. He pays his weekly rate in cash when he has it. He screens every single call from an unknown number, constantly looking over his shoulder, living in a perpetual state of exhausting paranoia. Marcus, it seems, is a remarkably patient man, and he is determined to collect his $250,000 debt, dollar by miserable dollar. Some men spend their entire lives chasing the next big win, completely blind to the fact that they have already gambled away the only prize that actually mattered. As for me, my evenings are beautifully quiet. Right now, I am sitting by the hearth of my living room fireplace, listening to the dry birch logs crackle and pop. In my lap rests a pair of bamboo knitting needles and a skein of incredibly soft baby blue merino wool. I am knitting a tiny, intricate cardigan for my grandson, Leo. I sip my chamomile tea, letting the warmth settle deep in my chest. I loop the baby blue yarn over the bamboo needle, counting the stitches with a practiced rhythm. Purl 2, knit 2. It is a slow, methodical process, much like rebuilding a life. Every stitch is a deliberate choice, a small but undeniable proof that from the ruins of betrayal, something beautiful and lasting can be created. Every time I pull the thread tight, I think about the $350,000 sitting safely in a fortress of legal parchment, completely untouchable. I think about my parents, Thomas and Martha, and the 40 years they spent sweeping floors and organizing brass fittings in that dusty Ohio hardware store. Their legacy didn't end in the grubby hands of a loan shark in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Their legacy is safe. My family is safe. People often mistake a quiet woman for a weak one. They think because we don't scream, we don't have teeth. They assume that because we endure, we will accept whatever indignity is handed to us. But they fail to understand the true nature of our stillness. A woman's silence is never submission. It is a workspace where she builds her boundaries. If you like this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of this.